Hello and welcome. One of the big ideas of India's G20 presidency has been to try and regulate crypto assets, and we've had the International Monetary Fund playing a very important role in putting together an architecture which could help regulating crypto assets in the global economy. To talk about this, we're joined here at the Le Méridien Hotel in the National Capital by the first Deputy Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, Dr. Gita Gopinath. Thank you so much for joining us and welcome. So could you start by explaining the mechanism that you're hoping to bring together? You know, you've advanced the timelines, brought out a paper which looks at regulating crypto assets. So many people who trade or were trading in crypto assets, very curious to know how exactly will this function?
Yeah, this is one of the big achievements of India's G20 presidency, which is to bring together, when it comes to crypto assets, not just the regulatory aspect, but also the macro financial consequences. So for the first time, they brought together the Financial Stability Board, who does regulation, and the IMF, who does macro financial stability, and said, come together from that holistic perspective, what kind of policy actions are needed. So for instance, when it comes to monetary issues, you know, one of the clear statements is do not legalize the use of any crypto asset like Bitcoin for legal currency, because that would affect monetary sovereignty. When it comes to financial stability, the guideline is to make sure that you have such issuers of such crypto assets, that they are licensed, that they're registered, and you have the principle that if it's the same activity, same risk, then you have the same action in terms of the way you treat it. So it's laid out a very good set of broad principles. The work is not over because there's a roadmap in terms of what else needs to be done going forward. But this is the first time the global community has come together and agreed on a common set of principles.
So the good thing is there's no talk of banning crypto. I mean, the idea that crypto is tough to ban has kind of gone through. But what concerns me is that different countries have adopted different positions on the spectrum of policy making and dealing with crypto assets. Do you think this provides a common framework? I ask because the G20 regulations or whatever comes out of the G20 isn't necessarily binding.
That's certainly right, and there cannot be one size fits all, just given the complexity of the world and different levels of financial development, the kinds of supervision and regulation they can have, and so on. So there is going to be some tailoring to country-specific circumstances. But everybody agreed that these broad principles we're all on board with.
Okay, do you want to give those watching a broad sense of what to expect once these principles are indeed accepted, and the kind of timelines that you're looking at this moment for these principles to be brought into policy?
I think it's going to be much less of the Wild West that we've had for a long time. By throwing light on the different issuers of these kinds of crypto assets, we're going to have much better data of what they're doing, what the extent to which they're penetrating into different, different people's pockets. There is going to be, if it's clear that you are effectively a speculative investment class, then you're going to be regulated in one way. If you're being used for payments, then you're going to be regulated as other payment systems are regulated. It's going to take some time to build up the specific details of it, but much more transparency, much more light being shed on it, and not the anything goes kind of environment.
Let's spend a moment on your reading of the Indian economy at the moment. Seen as one of the key growth engines of the global economy. India projected to grow at 6.1% 2023, 6.3% next year, but concerns also being raised about private investment, and private investment not kickstarting in quite the way the government would have liked. So do you want to share your reading of how you think the economy is doing at this moment?
Now, India is and continues to be an engine of global growth. So we have, for this fiscal year, we expect growth to be over 6%. And two factors that are driving it are public investment, which has been quite strong, and resilient consumption spending. So I think those are the two important factors. I mean, our estimate is that for this year, for 2023, India's growth would explain about 15% of global growth, right? So that is a substantial chunk of global growth that's being driven by India at this point. But to get to much higher levels of per capita income and to get to continued high levels of growth, you need structural reforms, and that's going to be very important. And there are multiple fronts on which these reforms will be needed. Those will be needed also to attract private investment. You know, a lot has been put in place in terms of improving the ease of doing business, but there is still a lot more that
you
needs
want
to
to
be
spend
done.
a moment talking about that, because this government heads into an election, and of course all of what you're saying is not linked to elections. But of all the structural reforms that you'd like the government to push through, what is it that you think could have the biggest multiplier and the fastest improvement in the level of private investment?
So creating an enabling environment for private investment, clearly very important. On that front, continuing the investment in public infrastructure, hugely important. Digital public infrastructure is playing a very important role. But in addition to that, you know, some of the harder decisions when it comes, for instance, to labor markets is needed. Now, that's not something that the center can do, because you put, I mean, there's clearly reforms have been announced for labor market reforms, but many states have not implemented them yet. So that's going to be required. So if you actually see in terms of where foreign direct investment goes in India, there are about 4 states. There's Maharashtra, Karnataka, Gujarat, Delhi, that get a lot of a big chunk of the investment, and it's not going to other parts. So a lot has to be done at the level of state governments. Secondly, of course, again, what I said about the ease of doing business, that it's still the case that there is a fair amount of red tape in opening businesses in India. That's going to take some work. Education, in terms of improving the quality of education, making it, you know, there are some fantastic institutions over here, but the depth of it needs to be improved. More work on that front. Female labor force participation is way lower than what it should be at this level of development in India. It's very low. Raising that up would make a big difference. So these are some of the reforms that would be helpful.
You may have seen some commentary recently about concerns being raised internationally about whether the government is overstating economic growth. Came out 7.8% was the estimate that was put out recently. Is that a concern that you have? Because that's been a big concern somewhere else, and now there's this controversy. So I'm kind of wondering, what's your reading of that?
No, this is not something that we are concerned about. You know, we look at a bunch of data. We look at lots of high-frequency data and so on, and you know, these are the numbers that we take.
Let's spend a moment on digital public infrastructure, which has been one of India's big ideas during this G20 presidency. And you travel internationally, you're seeing what's happening in global economies. Do you really think India's tech stack is of as much utility internationally as the government hopes it can be?
I think India is really on the forefront in this area. It is, I mean, it's already seen the benefits for India itself. I mean, not just in terms of innovation and what it's brought in, but also on the fiscal front in terms of much more efficient spending, the ability to collect revenues, formalizing the economy. All of that has been phenomenal. I mean, that India is really a leader in that front, and other countries in the world are paying attention to what India is doing in this space.
Do you see other countries wanting to adopt these technologies? Do you see this as being a part of what India can export in terms of ideas and tech globally?
I think it already is doing that, actually. It is absolutely exporting those ideas. There is now a push to make sure that we have platforms that are interoperable, that, you know, speak across borders, because clearly, you know, there are different forms. There's PIX in Brazil, which has the features of India's UPI, but at the same time is different in other respects. And the question is whether you can have a much more integrated platform. There's work being done on that front. But, you know, organically, a lot of these exchange of ideas is happening.
Let's spend a moment on your reading of the Chinese economy at the moment, which is one of the big concern areas. The obituary of growth in China has been written often and has always proven wrong. But there are also concerns that maybe this time the distress is deeper and more real than it has been in the past. How do you read all the data that's coming or not coming out of China?
Now, after a first quarter that was very strong because of the rebound from the reopening, China's economy has slowed. And we see that in private consumption. The real estate sector, of course, has had a lot of trouble for a long time. And we saw some improvement in the first few months of this year. But then again, we're seeing a deterioration. So that is an area of important concern. So investment is just down. confidence is down, consumer confidence, and just broadly private sector confidence is down. Now, the good news is that China has the resources to be able to turn things around. It still can do much more in terms of fiscal policy and in terms of monetary policy, and they are taking actions in that dimension. But these are things that can't necessarily be turned around overnight. I mean, we expect China's growth to slow. For this year, for instance, we still think that it can meet the target that the government has set of about 5%. But then into the medium term, we have China's growth projected at around 3.4%, going down. So that's where we are. It's not like we're expecting to see a very deep downturn or a sharp recession or anything of that kind, but just slowing growth.
So slowing growth at this level of economic evolution is understandable. But there are people who take it one step further and say, because, for example, youth unemployment, June was 21%, before they shut off unemployment data, they say the distress is much deeper and darker than the mandarins in Beijing would have us believe.
Well, it's more than just saying that China's reached the size of an economy where the growth slows down, right? It's certainly more than that, because we have revised down our projections for China relative to the pre-pandemic, given the developments we've seen in the property sector.
And in your revised projections, is there a point where China still overtakes the US? Because that's become a matter of global commentary about whether China ever does overtake the US in terms of the size of the economy.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, given the downgrade, it's going to take longer. Whether it will or will not will depend upon what kinds of policies the government does take at this point. Like I said, it has the space to be able to make changes to its economic path. But the combination of what we're seeing in terms of the property sector, the slowing confidence, the fact that the global demand, especially for manufactured goods, has come down quite a bit. I mean, all of this are headwinds for China.
We saw the US Commerce Secretary, Gina Raimondo, when she was in Beijing recently, speak about China becoming increasingly uninvestable, that ad hoc economic decision-making is making it very complicated for American companies, international companies to invest in China. Do you see this pulling away, or this, not necessarily decoupling, but reducing interdependence being now cast in stone, or do you think there is likely to be an economic rapprochement more than we've seen so far?
No, I do think that we are in a time of geoeconomic fragmentation. We're certainly seeing these geopolitical tensions are showing up in countries, moving away from each other. For instance, Rahul, if you look at the import restrictions that have been put, last year 3,000 new import restrictions were put. That was 3 times the number that was put in 2019. And if you look at where FDI is going, it's much more driven by now geopolitical considerations as opposed to geographic distance, which used to play a bigger role. So we are certainly seeing countries distancing themselves in terms of the amount of integration, relative to how much of integration they had in the past. The whole language of we're trying to de-risk and not decouple, I think is fine. It's much more harder to do in practice and not go down a slippery slope. So this is a challenge for the world, and we've been at the IMF. I mean, this is one of our jobs, is to flag the risks to the world from this.
What are the risks at this moment? Because from India's perspective, it could possibly be a huge opportunity. To what extent have you been able to capitalize on the opportunity? The government, through its production-linked incentives, through its Make in India scheme, Atmanirbhar India, trying to pull away from China as part of anybody who's looking to reorient their supply chains in keeping with China Plus One. To what extent is India benefiting? That's from an Indian point of view, and what are the risks that you're observing from a more macro level?
Yeah. No, in terms of the, in terms of the signaling, in terms of intent, when you talk to people and when you look at projects being announced, there is certainly a big interest in India right now, especially in terms of the new policy of diversifying away from, for instance, from China. But if you look at the last 2 decades of manufacturing in India, the share of manufacturing in GDP hasn't changed much. It's been around 17 to 18% over the last couple of decades, right? So, clearly a greater push is needed in terms of attracting all that investment in, and in terms of making sure that manufacturing has a higher share in production, and Make in India is a bigger success. More will be needed.
you spoke of risks, because the IMF's task, you said, is also to highlight risks as this untangling happens. What are the risks that concern you the most?
One is on inflation in the major economies. The good news is that it has been coming down. There have been hopeful signs, but we're not there yet. And we could still have a situation where inflation, yes, has come down, but doesn't go close enough to the targets of central banks, in which case they will need to raise interest rates by a lot more. And then we might not have the kind of soft landing that everybody's projecting at that time, and that could be a real shock to the global economy. Second is the war is not over. Russia's invasion of Ukraine continues. You could see big impacts on energy prices again, on food prices. That remains an important risk. China is a concern. I think the downside risks to China's growth have gone up. And we're seeing a lot of climate-related events, weather events around the world that's disrupting growth and affecting prices.
Okay, so let's take it one by one, because one of the things that was discussed in India's G20 is not linked directly to the G20, but President Biden, MBS from Saudi Arabia, spoke of an India, Mid East, Europe corridor, and the IMF is one of the bodies that will be involved in arranging financing for that. How do you see this infrastructure corridor play out?
Yeah. So firstly, we don't get involved. The IMF doesn't get involved in infrastructure
projects. I just
projects.
saw Emmanuel Macron's press conference where he was speaking about working with the IMF and the World Bank in the project.
Yeah. So on project financing, it's squarely the World Bank. Of course, we get involved whenever there is a macro issue to deal with. This is a fresh announcement. I know that there's a lot of enthusiasm for it, but I think it's too early to comment on the details of it.
Okay. The other thing that's raising a lot of headlines is the idea that India will soon be the world's third largest economy. How soon do you see that happen? That it will happen sometime in the next few years seems inevitable. 2027 is one estimate, which is the SBI's estimate, seems the most aggressive estimate. Others say it could happen 2028, 2029. What's your reading at this moment?
Yeah, I think what you said, that yes, in a few years, not too long, in a few years, in the ballpark of the years you're talking about, based on current projections.
What are your current projections for
that? Would be, so if you looked at the last estimates we put out in July for India's growth, I think you'd get around there to 2027, 28. I think that's when you would get to the third largest. But I think there's a lot more that needs to be done, and the more important thing is to maintain a high growth momentum for many more years than just the next 4 or 5 years. And that
so
will
you think it could happen
reforms.
by 2027?
Based on, in terms of the dollar, yes, in current dollar terms, you could, based on projections, it could get there by 27, 28. I think that's
but
based
you're
on
also
that
saying
fiscal.
that to keep the growth momentum going, you'd
Yes.
like to see a lot more.
Yes,
What
I mean,
more?
again, it's, India is a large country, so in per capita terms, that will still be a small number, even if you're overall the third largest economy. So India needs to keep pushing on that front to keep the growth momentum going much more.
We interviewed someone you know well, Borge Brande, the president of the World Economic Forum, and at the India at 100 Summit, he spoke of the next 10 years, seeing the Indian economy hit a $10 trillion value, and he said that the global economic order would be defined by what he called the G3, the US, China, and India. I'm kind of wondering what you think of that.
Okay, firstly, I'm not a huge fan of these projections of $10 trillion and so on. As we know, over the last 3 years, a lot can happen. We had the pandemic, we had the war,
Sure.
Things can get derailed, and other things can go wrong. So setting aside those, big headline numbers, I think the important thing is that India is a very important player on the global stage. Clearly, through the G20, it signaled a serious leadership role, even in terms of the world growth. Like I said, it's contributing like 15% to world GDP growth. I think there's a lot more that needs to be done. It has a young demographic population, which is, again, a big asset. But you need to be able to catalyze that through structural reforms.
And how has this G20 been for you? Because on the finance track, there's been so much that's been happening. You spoke of India signaling global leadership. So what are the signals that you've been picking up, and how's this year been for you?
Well, I think it's been a great year for India's G20 presidency. nobody expected that there would be a leaders' declaration. The fact that there was one, I think, is a huge deal. It tells you that even though we can all be, countries can have very different opinions about the way the world is headed, they can actually come together and have a declaration. That I think is huge. The second thing I think they did really well was to, put a lot of light on the issues that emerging and developing countries care for. So bringing the African Union in as a member of the G20 on a permanent basis is another big step in that direction. And all of the work that's been done on the crypto regulation, on debt and debt issues, and multilateral development banks financing, I mean, all of that are all part of how the Prime Minister refers to as the need to help the Global South.
Do you want to share some light on how you think global indebtedness for those countries that are heavily indebted is being dealt with, and what more would you like to see?
After a long time, I think we're beginning to see progress on that front. For me, the debt relief and the debt restructuring that was done for Zambia is quite a landmark. Mm-hmm. We had creditors of all different, the Paris Club, non-Paris Club, private creditors all come together to agree on a set of restructuring for Zambia. I think that's a big deal. India, along with the IMF and the World Bank, were part of put out the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable. That has played a very important role and also in trying to engage and trying to fix problems in the global debt architecture. So I think we've made progress, but a whole lot more is still needed, and we need to make these restructurings happen at a much faster pace.
Outside of all global macroeconomic questions, you may have seen that one video of the IMF boss, Kristalina Georgieva. She's doing a Samadhi dance number, and I'm wondering, when you're seeing that video, what's going through your head? And she's been smashing the internet.
Yes.
And earlier, you were the one IMF nominee that most people know. She's not there yet, but she's getting there. A couple of more dance moves, and then she's going to smash the internet some more.
Now that's typically Kristalina. That is her. She loves to dance. So, when she sees other people dancing and she sees good music, hears good music, she wants to get in.
She was the only one who got into the groove, okay? She was like totally having fun and joining in. Most of the others saw dur se, but she went in and really was part of the cultural immersion.
Absolutely. No, that's her. That's just total her.
You're not doing that. There's been talk of millets and pushing millets linked to climate security, linked to using less, using less water. But then there's also just overdose of millets, right? You were at the State Banquet. How was it? You loved your millets, or not so much?
There was a lot of millets. It was very good. It was delicious.
You're being diplomatic.
No, I enjoyed it. But yes, there were a lot of millets in the menu.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Fantastic having you with us, and we wish you all the best. And I hope you eat some millets and get to eat some non-millets as well. Thank you very much for your time. Thanks, Gita.
Thank you.
Thank you.